All right, guys, I'm here for the beginning of Unit 7. We are moving on to what everybody's been waiting for all year long, a survey of marine species. We're going to finally start talking about some different species. We're going to do it in broad terms mostly. But before we get into some of the different types of organisms that live within the ocean and do this survey of marine populations, 7.1 is just a little bit more information about evolution and natural selection. We're going to be talking a lot about the adaptations of different organisms as we look at each different type of organism in a marine ecosystem. And so having that strong background in natural selection is going to help make sure that we can help understand and identify those adaptations. Let me take this thing out. Don't need that right now. All right, so let's get going. In your evolution box, remember you are writing the bold parts as you go along in your study guide. It's there in the same folder where you found the slideshow in the video. So in our evolution box here, evolution includes all of the changes in the characteristics and diversity of life that have occurred throughout time. Can occur both large and small scale. The large is called macroevolution. The small scale is called microevolution. Don't need to have that memorized. In fact, I bet you could have figured it out yourself. All right, still in that same box. The concept of evolution was not new in Darwin's time. He did not come up with the idea of evolution, but the idea of evolution was not widely accepted because there was not a mechanism for it. It was not understood how it worked. It was believed that maybe it was possibly happening, but they couldn't figure out how. Similar to what was happening with Pangea and plate tectonics, so that idea of how the continents could possibly be moving. They noticed that things were changing, that species were evolving over time, and they couldn't figure out how, and so largely the idea was rejected. Until Darwin, who provided that mechanism with his theory of natural selection. He did not come up with the idea of evolution, but he gave it the kind of the ground underneath it for evolution to be able to stand on with the theory of natural selection. So in natural selection, in any population of organisms, there's going to be variation. This word variation is going to be pretty important. Right now you're writing this in the natural selection box, but you'll notice that there is a variation box that's coming as well. So some of these variations are going to allow those who possess them to be able to survive and reproduce better than those without it. Really, that's natural selection ultimately is all about reproduction. Who's going to survive long enough to be able to reproduce and pass on their genes? The idea that some of these genes are going to be more helpful for survival than others. So the successful traits are going to spread through the population as those who are able to survive reproduce. So this change in the frequency of genetic alleles in a population is referred to as evolution. It's a change in frequency of alleles. Meaning, how often does this genetic trait show up within a species? And as that changes over time, that is evolution. So one of the things that Darwin observed is that organisms have the potential for very high fertility. He looked at creatures like turtles and birds, saw that there were a lot of offspring. If you can see it, there's an image of a sea turtle down here laying eggs, lots and lots and lots of eggs. And what he realized was that most of those will not make it into adulthood, which is why species are adapted to be able to produce lots of offspring, because so many will not be able to survive. If a species exists that has a very low survival rate for its offspring, but also a very low rate of reproductivity, then that species will likely go extinct. So despite this high potential for fertility, natural populations usually remain constant in size except for small fluctuations. That's because not all of them are surviving into adulthood. Sea turtles are a really great example of this. The resources that organisms need to survive are limited, and so that's going to create competition. Food, water, shelter, nesting sites, all that creates competition within that species. Not all of them are going to be able to survive. So the survivors represent the small part of that species, of the individuals who are able to reproduce and provide their genes to the next generation. So the survivors are just a small part of each generation. All right, get into our variation box. Yeah. So when individuals survive, it's usually not a matter of luck. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But typically it's not luck. It's going to have to do with their particular traits. So populations have variation, meaning that individuals are not all the same. That these individuals can differ in many ways. That's what variation is, the differing traits within a species. For humans, some are tall, some are short. Some have red hair, some have brown hair, some have blonde hair. Skin tones are different, eye colors are different. This is all variation within the species. Some of that variation between individuals within a population is heritable. So heritable is one of our important terms for this lesson. It's when traits can be passed down from one generation to the next. There are some things that can be passed down, some things cannot. So some of the traits found in the population enhance that survival and that possibility for reproduction. The favored traits get spread through the population. Again, just making sure that we understand this. Over many generations, that species will then be adapted to its environment based on who was able to reproduce and who did not survive to the age of reproduction. So over time, these changes can lead to the formation of a new species. Over multiple generations, in the process of adapting to an environment, it may lead to new species. So a species may become adapted to its environment through environmental pressures. I don't want to talk a ton about that. I want to keep on moving to our bold stuff here. So populations evolve, that's our next box here. When an environment changes, so sometimes the species may be introduced to the environment and it may have to adapt. Sometimes, with a lot of it happening right now around the world, the environment itself may change, and so the species that are within that environment have to adapt, or sometimes try to move on to an environment that they're more likely to be able to survive in. This, too, sometimes results in a new species. And then this is one of the big things. If you don't get anything else out of 7.1, this is one of the absolute things we really want to make sure that you understand, is that individuals do not evolve. Populations do. So if a shark is forced out of its ecosystem and goes into a new ecosystem, and it has to learn to try to survive in that new ecosystem, it will not adapt its traits. It won't grow longer fins or a shorter body or shorter intestines based on what it's now having to eat. Like it does not adapt. This is something that happens over multiple generations through a population, through natural selection, not in an individual. Evolution is measured in changes, relative proportion to the heritable variation, blah, blah, blah. We'll keep moving. All right, this is still in that same populations evolve box. Natural selection can work only with heritable traits. Acquired traits that are not heritable are not subject to natural selection. I mean, the things about you that you acquired. Let's say you dyed your hair. It was brown and now it's blonde. You're not going to pass down the trait of blonde hair down to offspring. You acquired that trait. You did not inherit that trait. You will pass down the hair color that was inherited. And last but not least, for our upsetting genetic equilibrium box, this is one slide just with a lot of information here on it. They get everything here that's bold. Natural selection is not the only way that alleles change frequency. So they can change in a couple of different ways. One of them is genetic drift, which is just a random loss of alleles. Another is mutation, where a mutation can happen that can add a new allele to that population, and it may accidentally be something that could work out for the population, and then ultimately meaning it will get passed on to the next generation. You have non-random mating. This is where particularly we interfere with species and intention. We see this in the agricultural world all the time. Plants and animals, all kinds of stuff, where we are intentionally breeding, this animal with this animal because we want this trait. We do it all the time. Dogs are a really great example of this. So all the variations that we have within the dog population now for our domestic dogs is created by people intentionally breeding dogs looking for certain traits. We want it to be fast. We want it to have a big head. All stuff that we intentionally try to do. That's non-random. And then migration, the shuffles that happen in alleles between populations because of migration from one area to another and coming into contact with variation. Maybe you run into members of the same species but who have slightly different alleles. You're still the same species, so you're still able to reproduce together, and in that sense your alleles, your lineage is being combined with another line and creating a variation within that population. There are a few more slides after this that kind of go into greater detail about things like genetic drift, and if you want to learn a little bit about the bottleneck effect, but I'm not going to walk you through all that. None of that's on the test. That's just if you are particularly interested. Get excited, because next week when we start 7.2, we will start talking about species. Woo! Peace.